Okay. So, what we're talking is the most basic teaching of Buddhism, which is the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. We'll also talk today about the 12 links of dependent origination, and together these two constitute the most basic teachings of the tradition. So last time we talked about suffering, and we talked about three aspects of suffering: impermanence, suffering, and no self. These are the three characteristics of the first noble truth, the truth of suffering. Impermanence is the basis, is a reality that we live in a changing reality and that we ourselves are changing. And so this condition entails that we go through constant changes in terms of how we experience the world. And this experience of the world can be captured in a way by the three types of feelings: unpleasant, pleasant, neutral feelings. And so these three feelings are connected to the three types of suffering we talked about, right? The suffering, unpleasant feeling is what's called the suffering of suffering, which is the suffering that everybody identify as suffering. And then we have the suffering of change, which is pleasant feelings. And it's a form of suffering because though it is pleasant, it is by itself not a form of happiness. It's just a relief from suffering. And if we were to undergo consistently the experience that we find pleasant, that experience would turn into its contrary, suffering. And so it shows that though pleasant, and there is nothing wrong with that, it is not an experience which is beyond the realm of suffering, and so we should not get very attached to this kind of pleasant experiences, however pleasant they are. And when we talked about the suffering of conditioned existence, which is the fact that our body and mind is constantly changing, and this constant change and struggle with the environment is the basis, the precondition for the arising of the two forms of suffering. And the sutra talks about, now this bhikkhu is a noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, union with what is pleasing, suffering, separation from what is pleasing is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the five aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. So the five aggregates, body and mind, is the basis for suffering, and this suffering starts with birth, which start the whole cycle of our struggle with a constantly changing world. And in that struggle, we go through various experiences, but we are never beyond the realm of suffering. And that's the first truth of suffering that we talked about last time. Any question? Okay, so let's go to the second truth. The origin of suffering. So the classical teaching that lamas will give is to say that the origin of suffering is klesha. I don't know how you translate that. Contaminated states of mind, polluted states of mind, passions is the old translation. So kleshas are something like aversion, attachment, aversion, ignorance, pride, jealousy, and all the stuff that comes so frequently in our mind. And that's one truth of source of suffering. And then the other is karma, right? And that's a classical teaching that you probably all have heard, that Buddhist teachers give, particularly lamas give, when they talk about the origin of suffering, klesha, and how klesha leads to karma, which leads to suffering, right? Everybody is familiar with that? Already heard, right? Now, if you look at the teaching here, this is what it says. Now this bhikkhu is a noble truth of the origin of suffering. It is this craving which leads to renewed existence, accompanied by delight and lust, seeking delight in here and there, that is craving for sensual pleasures, craving for existence, craving for extermination. Yeah, I'm not sure about the translation, but okay. So what you notice here, that there is no talk of karma. What it's talking about is the process of suffering seen from, if you want, a phenomenological point of view, right? What do I mean by phenomenological point of view? Phenomenology is the examination of experience. So a phenomenological point of view would be a description of suffering from the point of view of how we experience, how we go through the experience of suffering, right? And that's what this sutta, which is supposed to be the first teachings of the Buddha, talk about the origin of suffering, right? Talk about the origin of suffering in terms of klesha, right? In terms of these polluted states of mind, which are ignorance, aversion, attachment, and so on, right? So this is what I call the phenomenological perspective on the origin of suffering. And it's a perspective which talks about the origin of suffering as seen from the perspective of human experience. We don't experience karma. Karma is not something we really understand, and I will come back to that later. But if we pay attention to our experience, we can understand how this experience, how in the experiences that we undergo, we construct a person, a self, which is constantly not only undergoing the process of suffering, but reacting in the wrong way, right? What do I mean by this? Well, it's again comes back to feelings. Feelings is incredibly important in Buddhism. This is why we say we are sentient beings, right? We're sentient beings. We are, because we are beings for whom sentiency is of the foremost importance, right? So in Buddhism, we don't say we are conscious being. We say we are sentient being, because sentiency is what is most important. And what is sentiency is this ability to undergo experience and to feel this experience in pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral ways, right? Now, why are these feelings so important? Because they conditions the way we are going to react to experience. Reality is changing. That's a basic teaching of impermanence, right? And in a way, there is nothing wrong with that. The main problem comes from the way we connect to, we react to this reality, right? Which, to this fundamental reality, which is this constant change that we undergo and that our environment undergoes as well, right? And what is this mistaken way to react is we react as sentient beings. And how do sentient beings react? They react on the basis of their feelings, right? If they feel good, how do they react? They want more. If they feel bad, how do they react? They don't want it. They react with aversion, right? And that process is a conditioning, right? A very deep conditioning that we have, which completely structure not all, but most of our experiences, right? Good feeling, I like it, I want it more, more, more. Bad feelings, no, 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 no. And that's the basic conditioning that is the origin of suffering. So the origin of suffering is very simple. It's this conditioning that we have, which make us react basically like Pavlovian dogs, right? When you give the famous Pavlovian dog good food and you associate the good food with a little bell, when you ring the bell later, the dog starts to salivate, right? And that's how we work. That's how we function, right? We're not different than the Pavlovian dog, right? When there is something good, we want more. When there is something bad, we don't want it. We react with aversion, right? And that's the fundamental origin of suffering. The klesha, the conditioning in terms of I like it or I don't like it, right? And that's how we function, right? Now, when we explain that, we are not talking about karma. We're not talking about, I mean, if you read the text, the original, it is this craving which leads to renewed existence. Now you can take this to refer to reincarnation, but you don't need to do that. I mean, you can understand renewed existence, this constant construction that we make of ourselves through our experience, in terms of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feelings, right? And that construction is accompanied by delight and lux, seeking delight here and there, that's craving for sensual pleasures, craving for existence, craving for what's usually translated as non-being. Now, sometimes there is a different list of three, and it refers to the three realm of existence, the desire realm, the form realm, and the formless realm. But that doesn't matter. The main thing is to understand how this origin of suffering, this constant polarity through which we structure our reactions to the world, how this fundamental polarity creates this, what the sutra called this renewed existence. We constantly construct ourselves, reconstruct ourselves on the basis of that kind of reaction, right? And that's the origin of suffering as understood by this sutta. So when I teach students, I assume you're all familiar with what Buddhists mean by attachment, right? When I teach students, I make a very strong difference between attachment and loving kindness, because I think it's an extremely important difference. But since you're all senior students, you all know about the difference between attachment and loving kindness, and you understand that when we say that we should undo attachment, we are not talking about becoming apathetic to the world. We are talking about how we should react to experience instead of wanting more and so on. We should have an equanimous attitude to experience and then understand how we can help others, right? And that's where loving kindness comes in. And so loving kindness and attachment are very, very different. And this difference is extremely important to understand Buddhism. But since you all been practicing Buddhist for years, I assume that you understand this difference, that you don't think that Buddhist promotes apathy, and you understand that loving kindness and compassion are extremely important because they are the attitudes that we need to develop to replace this binomial of attachment and aversion, right? The difference is theoretically simple. Attachment is about ourselves. Loving kindness and compassion is about others, right? And that's a fundamental difference between the two. Now, in practice, it's a bit trickier because when we like other people, is this an attitude of attachment? Is this an attitude of loving kindness? Well, depends. It's complicated. Human mind is complicated, right? So the attitude, for example, of parents toward their children is probably a mixture of attachment and hopefully some loving kindness as well, right? So I assume you're all very familiar with this distinction. Do you have any question? Yes.
I have, a little confusion about attachment in sort of daily life where, there's this attachment of like wanting more versus, wanting to excel at what you do. Like you
Yeah.
want to be, successful at a company, whatever.
Yeah.
Like keeping that, like how to work with that.
Well, that's the distinction between attachment and other forms of motivation is in theory relatively clear, right? In practice, it's a bit complicated, right? Because we are so penetrated by attachment that it's going to be impossible to be completely free from attachment, right? So what should we do? Well, that's it's important to consider what's important in our life and then to slowly work at undermining this attitude of attachment and aversion, right? And how we do this is by meditating on impermanence and no self, right? And that's a way we undo attachment, but it's a very progressive, it's a very long-term process. And in the meantime, we obviously have to take care of our lives, right? But we have to try to be as unattached as possible, right? Not always easy. I think the hardest thing probably, I don't have children, but probably some of you have children. And so being attached to one's children is a very natural thing to do. And so, yeah, that's difficult.
Yeah, I was just thinking of, you know, how
Nobody
you
thinks that Buddhism is easy, right?
I was just thinking about, you know, how you expressed attachment, saying that, you know, it's how we react to experience of
Yeah.
wanting more, as opposed to, you know, reacting to experience with equanimity.
Yes.
So is that equanimity like catching yourself and like, as you said, thinking about the impermanence, the dukkha, or your own motivation before thinking about what to do?
That helps. Yeah. I mean, attachment is a form of grasping, right? We hold onto, we grasp to that experience as something that is intrinsically good, right? Which is an actually mistaken and deluded way to relate to the experience, right? Doesn't mean the experience is not good, but it's not intrinsically good, right? And so we hold to that experience as something we want more of, right? And that's where the problem is. That's the origin of suffering, right? Is this holding, is this grasping onto things, and to this grasping onto, and by things, I don't mean just external event, I mean experience, and I ultimately holding to one's body and mind, right? That's the ultimate form of attachment, right? And so when you talk about your own body, you understand the depth of attachment, right? Because there are a few things which are more dear to me than my own body, right? This is so vital when my body is touched. It's like, yeah. And so that's attachment, right? And so what we need to do is to develop, slowly undermine that attachment and develop a more equanimous way to relate to one's own body-mind complex, the beings around us, and the environment and the experience that we undergo when we interact with this environment, right?
Thank you.
So this is the origin of suffering, attachment and aversion, right? And attachment is this grasping onto whatever we're grasping onto as being intrinsically good. This is what I need. This is what you know, like when I teach my class, I give the example of getting a new iPod, but it's obviously a silly experience. But when I get a new iPod, I'm like, oh, this is great. This is so good, and so on, as if getting a new iPod was going to take care of myself, right? Or if was the ultimately satisfactory experience I can undergo. And that's just a delusion, right? And that delusion is what attachment is about. And we do this constantly towards, now an iPod is a kind of easy example because we can see that this is pretty silly, right? But when it gets to one's own body and mind, it's a lot tougher not to be attached, right? And so what we need to do is to slowly unwind this attachment by thinking about impermanence, by thinking about suffering and no self, right? This is why in the Lamrim almost starts from not the first, but the second or third topic is the impermanence of death, right? And impermanence of death is a kind of coarse way for us to understand impermanence. It's not the most subtle understanding of impermanence, but it's an understanding that hits at home very easily and very powerfully, right? Because if we undergo pleasant experience and we remember that we're going to die, well, this is going to help us to get some amount of equanimity, right? And so the impermanence of death is one of the first teaching of the Lamrim because this is a form of impermanence that we can understand really easily, that relates to us very in a very deep way, and therefore is very beneficial to think about one's impermanence. And when one develops that kind of realization, if one is successful, then the small thing of life becomes kind of silly, right? We're not going to get uptight because things are not turning the way we want them to turn, because we understand that we are mortal and we are facing death. And in comparison to facing death, these small events are not of particularly great importance, right? And so this is one simple way to undo attachment, right? Undoing aversion is a bit easier because aversion is obviously unpleasant, right? Being aversive is highly unpleasant. And so if we have aversion, we're not going to consider this as a great experience, though we will be deluded in thinking that our aversion protects ourselves. And that's obviously a delusion because aversion actually hurts us, right? But we think that it protects us because it raises a kind of something like a shield, right? And that's a shield of aversion, and that's not a good way to react to unpleasant experience. So this is the origin of suffering as understood in this teaching, right? Attachment and aversion, right? And both are based on this false conception of the self that we have as a kind of self-sustaining substance that lasts. And that's a fundamental mistake to understand ourselves. And that's a basis on which we start to feel attachment and aversion. We're attached because that false sense of self is kind of operating. And so we don't understand that things are transient, and we start to be involved in attachment, right? And similar, when feelings don't go away, we are involved in aversion, right? And that's the origin of suffering. More questions?
And Sheila has a question. Sheila, would you like to unmute?
Sure, yes. Um, I have been trying to figure out, I do understand that a lot of, transformation needs to occur in meditation for your mind to be transformed, that intellectually you can only go so far. What I'm curious about is, as we're talking about, we have aversion and we have attachment. And like you gave the example of your iPad, like how do we move forward knowing this with
We
the
what?
possessions we have?
What's that? What was the last sentence?
Yeah, how do we move forward knowing that, like you gave us the example of the iPad, like how does someone like myself move forward with, I have lots of possessions, and moving forward when I go food shopping or I go shopping for clothes, how do I then not get attached to it? Like, what do I say? Is there something I say to myself to say, oh, yeah, like I need this, but not attached to it? I don't know if I'm thinking clearly about it, but you know what I'm
No,
trying to
this
say?
is a 101 mistake. So thank you for bringing it up. New Buddhists think I should not be attached. That's a contradiction in terms. When you think I should not be attached, you're already attached. So you already have lost the game. The goal is not to try not to be attached, because that's a losing game. That's a lose-lose game. You're going to just create a problem for yourself. The goal here is to undermine attachment. And how do we undermine attachment? Is by meditating on impermanence, suffering, and no self, the three marks of existence. And when we do so, gradually attachment and aversion lessen. Why do they lessen? Because we remove the basis on which they grow, which is this false sense of self, this false sense of a lasting self existing in a lasting world, right? When we remove this illusion, when we understand the true depth of impermanence, we start to loosen the grip of attachment and aversion on ourselves. So the goal is not to try to think about, I should not be attached, because you have already lost the game. What you should try to do is try to develop some concentration and try to develop some understanding, for example, of impermanence, which is a relatively easy thing to understand. And then if you are more advanced, maybe understand no self and emptiness. And in this way, you can start to loosen the grip of attachment. Trying not to be attached is not going to work. It's just going to create more misery. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So when you loosen the grip, like as you're saying, where it comes to like more like
Let me give you an example before you answer. For example, I go take the plane quite often, and I'm a very impatient man. And if the plane is delayed or, God forbid, canceled, I start to freak out, right? It's like, oh my God, what's going to happen, blah, blah, blah. Now, if at this moment I start to think about my impending death, that's going to loosen the attachment, right? Suddenly I'm going to realize, look, this is silly stuff you have to deal with. Obviously, you should talk with the airline counter and try to get your flight and so on. But there is no need to freak out, because this is, as German would say, a Kleinigkeit, a small thing. So this is an example of how you loosen attachment, right? So you don't engage in a battle with attachment. What you do is you try to remove the cognitive basis of that attachment. And then suddenly your mind is much clearer, much more peaceful, and you are in a good position to deal with the ticket counter, which is not always a very pleasant experience. But instead of screaming at the person, which is my favorite strategy, you try to implement a different strategy and say, can you help me? And, blah, blah, blah. And that's the result of thinking about impermanence and of using your insight into impermanence to dissipate here, sorry, not attachment to, but aversion as well, right? Go on.
So do I buy the things I love? And there is a certain attachment to when you go shopping, you're attached to it because there's something about it that's attractive, and you bring it home, and you do have some like attachment to it. So do I say
Uh,
to
what
myself
kind of
something
thing?
about the thing? Well,
Because,
for example, like maybe clothes. Like I might
yeah,
buy
I
clothes
think
that
we
I
have
like.
a gender problem here. So, I'm a guy, and for me, if I have 3 or 4 set of clothes, I'm fine. And then my wife in a while say, you should look nicer. Why don't we get you a new shirt? But I'm the last person you should ask that question, because
Okay, maybe I'll change it to something different. Like for example, paintings, right? Okay, so there's like
okay.
painters I love, and there's paintings I have, and I'm attached to it because I love it. But what am I supposed to be saying to myself so that I'm not so attached to it?
Well, I don't know. I think art is a different kind of experience. The experience of art, I think, is a different kind of experience, because now, if you own a painting and then you're very attached to this painting, then I don't know. But in general, we don't, I mean, people like me don't possess art, right? We go to the museum to see art. And so it's an aesthetic experience, and you don't need to be attached. You just need to, I mean, for me, I just take delight. I'm not a big connoisseur, so I have very boring taste. Like I like impressionist, right? And post-impressionist. And so when I see the painting, I just take delight in the painting. I enjoy it. I don't think there is much attachment there, is there?
Um, for me, yes.
Really?
Uh, yeah, for me, like there's just things like in the
Yeah.
open that I naturally like and and then want to possess and want to buy it, and I do. And
Uh,
so as we're talking, I'm just looking around and saying, yeah, everything in here I love. And am I supposed to sort of
oh,
say, well, if I have to, do I then think of impermanence and say, well, I'll have to die one day, so all these things will have to go to somebody? Is that what I'm trying to be doing?
so this is why you turn off your camera, so that I cannot see all the beautiful things that you have.
No. No.
Okay, okay, just checking. Well, there is nothing wrong with enjoying beautiful things. Uh, the danger of beautiful things is that they are they're a bit harder to get less attached to them, right? Look, we're all going to be attached, right? As I say, attachment is a fundamental condition of sentient being and is very difficult to undo, right?
Yes.
So I think you should enjoy art. Now, if you get obsessive about it, then maybe I think you can start to think about impermanence, right?
Right.
Because, yeah, if you start now, I don't know how wealthy you are. Maybe in your room is full of impressionist masterpieces. I have no idea who I'm
No.
talking to, but uh, that's not the point. The point is not to be, I mean, art is a beautiful experience. And I think there is no reason to be obsessive about it, right? And if one is obsessive, then maybe one should start to think about impermanence, right?
Yes. Yes.
Because being obsessive is not a very fruitful way to relate to reality, right?
Yes.
Because the nature of reality is to be changing, and so to be obsessive is exactly the opposite way of a healthy way to relate to reality, right?
Yes. Thank you.
Did I answer your question or
Yes.
just
Yeah, no, no, you did because y what you said, I can see in the context of, yes, there was like something I felt like, you know what, I'm like my mind is just a little too obsessed about it. And I did use that strategy of like impermanence and
uh-huh.
uh and suffering and it I noticed my mind just kind of let it go, like it just like
Yeah,
it just let it go, and I was really surprised that I intentionally used this strategy and the obsession was gone.
that's exactly the word, let it go, right?
Mhm.
That's what we need to do to try to undo attachment is let it go. And thinking about impermanence is the easiest way to let it go.
Yes, and I feel like I've listened to so many Dharma talks, but maybe the speaker was trying to say that, but I didn't get the messaging of like because I would always listen to Dharma talks about how to let go and letting go, but there was never like a strategy. I guess in my for me to understand things, it needs to be like, okay, apply it like this, right? And
Right.
so
Nothing
like
wrong with that.
what you're saying is apply this, and so the this is like impermanence, for example. So I
That's
think
the
that's
easiest.
what, yeah, that's what was missing in like how do I let go? I just can't let go. But if I think about impermanence and what you're talking about, suffering and emptiness, then I think, you know, it it I don't know, it worked with me. I have
Okay,
hands-on experience that it did work with me once. So yeah,
good. Okay.
thank you.
Not a problem. Any more question about the origin of suffering?
Um,
Yes, please.
yeah, I had wanted just to know when this sounds like it's probably an early sutta, and I was just wondering when the notion that the origin of suffering contained two aspects, karma came into it.
Yeah, well, I was going to go there because there are two teachings that are fundamental. One is
Right.
the Four Noble Truths, and the other is the 12 links of dependent origination. And these two are very fundamental teachings. And I think I'm not a canonical specialist, but I think they're pretty early teachings. And so these two teachings are the two ways the Buddhist tradition, I mean, basically the two foundations of the Buddhist, two foundational teachings of the Buddhist tradition, right? One dealing with the, what I call to use a sophisticated term, the phenomenological approach, which is this approach of examining one's experience and how one's experience is part of the process of suffering. And the other, which is the 12 links of dependent origination, which is what I call the metaphysical approach, which is talking about how things are, right? And how things are is this process of suffering in which we go from ignorance to attachment to karma to various experiences in life, and then we go through the dying process, and then we start all over again, and then there is a new birth, which leads to more ignorance and so on, right? And so this process of the 12 links of dependent origination is the other way that the Buddhist tradition talks about suffering. And in there, the notion of karma is quite central, right? So the 12 links is ignorance, and then karma, and then consciousness, and then name and form, the 6 organs of sense, the 6 senses, contact, sensation, desire, attachment, existence, birth, death. These are the 12 links of dependent origination. And this is also a very early teaching. So on ignorance arise karma, on which brings about consciousness, which is usually understood as rebirth consciousness. So we are going from life 1 to life 2. And then in life 2, we have consciousness, we have name and form, which is a different aggregate, the body and mind. And then we have the 6 organs, and then we have contact, we have sensation, we have desire, attachment, and then we have again karma. And then on dependence of karma, created in the second life, the third life starts, right? So karma is very central to this way of understanding the process of suffering, which in Buddhism is called samsara, right? So samsara is a process of suffering which starts from klesha, which leads to karma, which leads to new birth, and then this whole thing starts all over again, right? And so in that way of understanding the teaching, karma is very, very central, right? So far from me, the idea that karma is not an original idea of the Buddha. I think it's interesting that we have these 2 ways of understanding suffering. And one is much more, in a way, readily available to people who do not share the cultural background from which this teaching are originating, right? And then the other one, which is a much more classical pan-Indian way to understand the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, and so on, right? And so these are 2 ways to explain the same process in very different ways. So in the second way of explaining the process, karma plays a very important role. Karma is thought to be intention, and the idea is that good karma brings good result, and then bad karma brings bad result. And here karma being intention, it means good intention brings about good result, and bad intention bring about bad results, right? That's the general teaching of karma, right? Now, obviously, the question is, what does it mean to be good or bad? Who determines that? And so on, right? And then we are getting into a complicated territory, because if I were to say, is good an action is good if that action helps self and others, that seems a nice way to go about it, right? Right? It's pretty nice. But you get into the nitty-gritty of the different kind of action, things gets a lot more complicated, right? So help self and others, what does it mean? For example, you have a suffering dog and you kill that dog out of mercy. Help self and others or not? Is this a good action or is this a bad action? Yes.
Um, don't things have to depend on your intention as I've been listening?
Yes, but
Like if your intention was
yeah, I
it
know.
it would save the
Yes,
dog.
yes, we're not talking, we're not Christy Nome, right? So we're not sadistic and killing dogs, right? We all understand that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a given, right? We are people, we are good people who have good intention, right? But when you kill sentient beings, you are ending their life, right? And their life is the most precious thing. And so teachers say that though your original intention might be good, at the moment of action, it's going to be hard to be really have a good intention. So that gets really quickly complicated, right? The phenomenology of suffering is easy because it is something we can understand through our own experience, right? Now, we may disagree, but this is why I became Buddhist. When I went to Dharamsala, I went to see a teacher who said, okay, sit down and I will teach you. And the first teaching was the three forms of suffering. And I thought, wow, this is really, really interesting to understand the nature of human existence, right? The nature of human condition. And that deeply resonated with me, which is why I became Buddhist. Now, if the teacher has said, well, independence on ignorance, desire drives, independence of desire, what was the formula? Sorry. Independence of ignorance, karma arise, independence of karma, consciousness arise, and so on, I would have said, what is this guy talking about? I have no idea, right? And the reason is that karma is a pretty tricky thing to understand. Now, the general outline of karma is Okay, we understand if we do good things, we can expect good results. That's kind of a folk with a piece of folk wisdom, right? And we understand that as a lot of folk wisdom, there is quite a bit of good common sense in it. So to say that good actions create good results is okay, right? But then once we start to inquire into what's the nature of that goodness and how does that work, then things get very, very quickly much more complicated, right? And so this is where we have to rely on an enlightened being who tell us what is good and bad. And so we have to rely on that being who tell us what is good is bad. And this is what moral precepts are for, right? This is what the precepts of keeping the 10 non-virtues, avoiding the 10 non-virtues, the 5 precepts, the monastic precepts, and all these different set of precepts are rules that we get from the tradition that helps us to understand what's good action and what's bad action, right? Now, that's not going to work all the time. For example, mercy killing remains a complicated question, right? Because one of the first precepts is to avoid killing. But then if the being is really suffering, are you really going to, well, that's a difficult question. I don't know the answer. So there are complicated situations that are going to be difficult to answer. But in general, it is important to understand that our actions have consequences, right? The greatest delusion is to think that we can do whatever we want as long as we are not caught. And that's a very superficial way to understand the cause and effect. And so it's important to understand that cause and effect go deeper than that. And so if we want to understand what's good action and what's bad action, obviously our common sense judgment is important, but the precepts are also important because they are going to give us rules that helps us to understand what we should do and we should not do. And that's why karma is so important in Buddhist teaching, because they tell us what kind of action, teaching of karma tell us what kind of action we could do or should do and what we need to avoid, right? And that's very important, right? And that's the teaching of karma, which is the second part of the teaching on the origin of suffering. Yeah, Richard?
Um, while you were talking, I was thinking of the Western cliche, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yes.
Uh, yeah, I could have the intention of wanting to ease the dog's suffering by operating on it, but since I'm an incompetent surgeon, I could kill the dog. How does any of this fit into theories of karma?
We are very prone to self-delusion, and we are very prone to give us a pass and to attribute to us the best possible intention, right? But that's not the reality. And so we have to fight against this tendency to give ourselves a pass, right? And so the teaching of karma is, and the precepts are the way to do that, right? They are guardrails which tell us, hey, you're going off the rail because you're violating one of the precepts, one of the you are committing one of the 10 unskillful actions, right? So this is a guardrail, and it tells us, well, maybe I don't have the best intention. Actually, what I am really is indulging myself, and I'm giving myself the path because I think I'm so great. But the reality is that I probably should not do that. Now, I do want to insist that karma is complicated, and so not everything is going to be covered by that. You may face very difficult situations in which maybe this is not enough, but for probably, I don't know, the 99 or 98% of actions, these rules probably work pretty well. And that's a way to think about karma, by following that, by being mindful of the action that we are doing and checking this action against the different rules, the rules of avoiding the 10 unskillful action. That's one way, for example, to check one's motivation, right?
So it sounds like what you're saying, if I understand it correctly, is that to understand whether or not an action is good or bad really requires an enlightened being. And
Yes,
since those are in fairly short supply, we do have nevertheless
exactly.
Precepts that other enlightened beings in the past have somehow or another come up with. And these give us a good heuristic for getting through a lot of the situations that we come into. But of course, they're not going to cover everything, right?
No,
And
with the 1% that is probably not going to be covered. But still, if it covers 98 or 99%, it's pretty good, right?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's the other 1% that's actually, it's something that's of interest, interests me, because ultimately then we are left to our own devices. And if I examine my motivations for doing just about anything, I would say that usually I have a very good intention in mind, and I'm mindful enough to roughly know my limitations. I'm not going to operate on a dog, for example. But there's always, in my mind, there's always a double or triple intentions. And some of those other intentions aren't there. And then ultimately we're left to fend, I think, for ourselves in that 1%.
Yeah, I don't know if it's even 1%, but it's some actions that might not. I mean, life is complicated. And the law of karma, now there are debates in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And when I was doing my Geshe examination, I was asked whether ordinary sentient beings can understand karma. And I took the negative position. And so many people were extremely upset. And I remember the abbot of the monastery was standing on his throne and screaming at me. But, I defended my position. And I have a lot of good sources about the fact that, no, we cannot understand the workings of karma in sufficient detail. There are general rules. We can understand that. We can have some idea about the nature of our attention. though this is actually tricky because if you, for example, look at the psychoanalytic literature, the notion of intention gets very, very complicated. And so it's actually a pretty complicated topic. And so it's important to be mindful of one's intention, but it's also important to be mindful of one's action in terms of the precept, because that gives us a pretty good guidance as to what we should do and not do.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The abbot disagreed with me. The abbot was furious, but I maintained my position successfully.
Yeah, I see your point. Thanks.
Okay, so there are three hands.
Sovansh, please go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I've asked, Sovansh, go ahead.
Okay, Professor Dreyfus, I just wanted to share, there was a question about attachment earlier. And one thing that I often, when I go back to, the Four Noble Truths, one thing that a teacher said once, helped me, is that the translation of the Sanskrit into English is not straightforward. The words like klesha, moha, raga, dvesha, these are not, for example, very often people say desire, right? They use the word desire.
Yeah,
and so what I actually heard was that, from this person's point of view, from this teacher's viewpoint, and I thought it helped, and I kind of see the point, is using, instead of saying desire is categorically bad, he used craving attachment, craving hyphen attachment. And when he was talking about aversion, he didn't use aversion, he used hatred hyphen hostility, or hostility hyphen hatred.
Yeah.
And then when it came to kleshas, many people use emotions, but he was categorically, he said, it's not emotions.
No.
There's a lot more than that. So I just wanted to share that because these translate the original Sanskrit words are more refined than than a direct translation.
I agree. Now, I agree. I never use the word desire because I use the word attachment, right? Because desire, for example, the desire to help others is not a form of attachment at all. It's a very positive mental state, right? And so the idea that every form of desire, of desiring something, is a problem, is a fundamental, is another 101 mistake, right? The problem is not desiring, the problem is grasping or being attached, right? Now, the second point you made about hatred, I disagree because
I think hostility hyphen hatred.
Yes, I understand, but that's only towards people. And I think you can be aversive towards experience, towards feelings, and so on. And so I think the word aversion is probably a better word here because it has a wider, it covers more cases. In the case of people, sometimes aversion is indeed hatred, hostility, right? But you cannot use the hatred, hostility with respect to your own, for example, feelings, right? And so I think aversion remains a valuable, a better way to. What was your third point?
My third point was kleshas don't translate into
Oh,
emotions.
yeah.
I'm not saying in any of these cases you used those words.
Okay.
I'm just sharing something that I heard that helped me.
Yeah. No, you're right. I sometimes use negative emotions. Obviously, emotions is way too broad, and they are good emotions. Precisely the point of Buddhism is that there's some very important emotion, like the emotion that you have when you're compassionate towards other people, right? So emotion obviously is way too broad. Now, some people use negative emotion. Some people use pollutions. It's a pretty tricky term to translate, but certainly emotion is the wrong translation. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for your remark.
Bianca, would you like to unmute?
Yeah, hi, thank you. I have a question. Maybe you can help me understand a little bit better. So when we're talking about trying to do something positive, like the example of the dog, how can I understand whether I'm doing something good out of compassion rather than out of I don't want to keep suffering because
Yeah.
I'm seeing somebody suffering?
Yeah. That's difficult.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's difficult. That's difficult. As a ordinary person like me, when I see other people suffering, I have compassion and I have aversion as well. And yeah, it's it's important. That's why it's important to be mindful of what's going on through one's mind, and then using the precept and the tools that the Dharma provide to try to get a handle on one's own motivation and intention. But that's not always easy. I mean, when teachers teach the Dharma, everything seems clear and wonderful and so on. And it is, in a way, clear and wonderful. But the reality of human existence is sometimes more difficult, right? So when we witness a person or a being who is suffering, uh, I know that I am very often very aversive. And yeah, and so it's important to be mindful and to try to generate compassion and be aware of one's own aversion, right? Welcome to the club. Did I
Sheil, would you
answer
like?
Yes?
I was going to
Hello.
ask you. Yeah.
Hello. So, could you please clarify this pressing question I have? I was in a workshop on the weekend. It's a, Dharma talk, and I didn't get a chance to ask this question. And I've heard like other Rinpoches talk about this. As we're talking about karma, they say like in the ultimate reality, there is no karma and there is no reincarnation. Can you please explain that?
Oh, that's pretty difficult. If you're a beginner student, I don't think you should bother with that kind of teaching. I think it's much more important to bother with this kind of teaching, which is talking about the reality of who we are. Now, when when people become highly realized and have great insight into the empty nature of things, then maybe things are different. Also, if people have a great insight into the nature of the mind, that's different. But these are not beginners teaching. These are the point of view of highly trained meditators who have years of practice and therefore can totally abide into this view of emptiness. And now you may be such a person, at which case this would apply to you as well. But if you're like me, much more of a beginner, yeah, that's really difficult. Now, if you have a good understanding of emptiness, you can start to understand this. But, you know, that's pretty advanced stuff. And by pretty advanced, I mean really advanced stuff. Like, yeah, I'm going to tell you a story. You might not like it, but I forgot the name of the Rinpoche who was kind of fed up by Westerners asking high teachings. And so he took a pot and filled it with shit and said, okay, for you, it makes no difference whether you eat that shit or you eat a club sandwich. I don't think that's the example he used, but anyway, if you eat yummy dumplings or that pot of shit, if that's for you exactly the same, then you are ready to get this high teaching. If not, well, work at the basics. Sorry for the grossness of the example, but I think it gives you an idea of the fact that, yeah, we have to really think about where we are and find the teachings that are appropriate. And that kind of understanding is really reflect a really high level of insight. I don't think it's very relevant to a person like me, at least. I wish it were. I wish I was a Mahasiddha who is able to transform shit into nectar, but I can tell you I'm not. I look at the internet to find good restaurants. I'm not the Mahasiddha who transform bad food into good food, into delicious experience. I wish I were.
Wow, thank you.
I wish I were. Anything else?
Yes, Professor, I had a question. This passage that you read on the origin of suffering,
Yes.
the last one, which says craving for extermination, I think you said craving for non-being.
Yeah.
I
Well,
wonder if you would explain that.
well, this is something. There are three forms of craving, right? And sometimes it's associated with the three realms: desire realm, form realm, formless realm. And then sometimes people talk about the fact that it's craving for sensual pleasures, which I gather is pretty self-explanatory. Now, craving for existence, that's not self-explanatory, but that's, so you have to think what it means, right? And so there is being and there is non-being, right? And I mean, the normal way to understand is to refer to the three realms, right? But I think we can also be a little bit more interpretive and think of it, yeah, craving for being and non-being is basically, it's basically our condition, right? We either crave for being something, for some kind of experience, or, and this is not good, we crave for non-being, right? For non-existence, because existence is a struggle, right? And so
That's what I was, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's not the usual traditional way to interpret, but I think these are pretty valuable way to interpret that, because they do tap into our condition, right?
That's what I was wondering, if is craving for non-being like really, I'm existentially tired of being and I just don't want to be.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but when you said the traditional approach for understanding craving for non-being, what is that traditional approach?
It's arupa.
So the formless realm.
Yeah.
So it's saying I don't want to form. The craving is to be formless,
Yes.
and the craving for existence is to
have
crave for the form realm.
For meditative form, yes.
Oh, I see. So so you crave for the desire realm, craving for the form realm, and craving for, I see. Okay.
Yes.
So it's not the Freudian death instinct.
Well, there is an expression in Tibetan Buddhist hermeneutics, which means the art, or the art of interpretation, that text have multiple interpretation. They say 100 interpretation, but 100 just mean multiple, right? It doesn't mean 99 plus 1, just multiple interpretation. So I think, both interpretations are okay, right?
Yeah, I thought another interpretation might be craving for my existence, craving for the extermination of my enemies.
That I never heard, but sure, why not? It's just the word extermination. I was surprised of the word extermination, because I have a great deal of, this is Bhikkhu Bodhi translation, right? And I have a great deal of respect to Bhikkhu Bodhi. Maybe I should send him an email that I was surprised by this translation. I don't know why he chose this term, because usually it's craving. It's usually translated craving from non-existence.
Okay.
Okay.
I have one other thought, Professor.
Yes.
Shall I ask next week?
You can ask now or next week.
Okay. Okay, I will ask now, given impermanence. So this is in the first paragraph of the sutra, where it says that the Tathagata has awakened to the middle way, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, direct knowledge. And then it says to enlightenment and nirvana. And I was just surprised to see the word enlightenment there and nirvana, because I thought in the sutras, they don't really speak about enlightenment. And
they do.
Yeah, but then from the Mahayana perspective, there's all this difference between nirvana and enlightenment, like what you need to be enlightened versus what you need to be an arhat. So I was just curious.
This is not Mahayana. So the Buddha makes no bone that he's enlightened in the sutra. He's not prone to false modesty. He's like, I am enlightened. And by enlightened, it means bodhi, right? And so next time we'll talk about the next two truths, the cessation and the path.
Okay. And then this is just a thought. So is he saying that if you did the Four Noble Truths the way he taught it, you would become enlightened?
Yeah.
But not in the Mahayana sense?
Oh, that's not a Mahayana text. But in the Mahayana sense, yes, you would be enlightened too. You would not be fully enlightened, but you would be enlightened.
Okay. Question for next week then.
Between complete enlightenment, full enlightenment, and enlightenment. That's a Mahayana difference.
Okay. I wasn't aware of that. So I'll ask you next week.
Okay.
Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Thank you,
Professor.
everybody. Have a good week.
Thank
too.
you. You too. Thank you, everyone. See you
Bye.
all next
Thank
week.
you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Sine.
Good
Thank
night.
you,
Bye-bye.
Peter.
Thank you.